Hello and welcome to another Modo Energy Power Markets live stream. Today we're going to be talking about the state of energy storage and grid scale storage in the ERCOT market located in Texas. My name is Brant Vermillion. I'm our U.S. research lead here at Modo Energy, and joining me today is my colleague Ovais.
Hi everyone, my name is Ovais. I lead our ERCOT market research here at Modo Energy.
So just getting into our agenda for today, here's a little bit of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to start out with a little bit on the state of storage today, the state of play in terms of storage deployment, the fact that we're at 12 gigawatts as of today, and a little bit how the composition of storage resources operating in ERCOT has evolved in the last few months and years, and how we think that's going to be evolving in the coming years as we trend towards more longer duration resources. Then we'll switch gears a little bit, talking more so about the revenue side of things, talking about the fact that ultimately in the last 12 to 18 months, revenues in ERCOT have been relatively low, and how that's to some extent resulted in a movement towards an appetite for more offtake agreements between market participants in ERCOT. Then we'll switch gears more so into the policy side of things, talking a bit about what's coming up in the upcoming months here with the go live of real-time co-optimization here in December. And then we'll zoom out a little bit more, talk a little bit about the wider policy implications of something like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and how that's going to impact deployment of storage, not just in ERCOT, but really across a lot of the rest of the country. Finally, we'll wrap up with some question and answer. So as we're going throughout the live stream, feel free to submit some questions in the chat, and our team is going to send them over to us, and we'll answer some towards the end of the live stream here. So as we get started here, I'm going to hand over to Ovais to kind of talk about where we stand today for batteries in ERCOT.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brant. So we're going to start with the state of the market update for where build-out has reached. And if we go straight into it, what these two lines show are the amount of rated power and energy capacity that are live in ERCOT today, commercially operational. We see that ERCOT's reached 12 gigawatts as of the end of September and 19.4 gigawatt hours in terms of energy capacity. I think there's two things to note here of significance. Firstly, that both of these lines are increasing at an accelerating rate. So despite revenue headwinds, we're seeing a record amount of battery capacity coming online. Last quarter was the highest amount of build out that ERCOT has seen to date, 2 gigawatts of rated power coming online. The second thing to note here is the fact that that energy capacity line in red is trending faster upwards than the rated power in blue. And to understand why, if we look at the amount of capacity that's been actually added in each quarter, what you see here, each column is showing the amount of new rated power added to the system, colored by duration. And I think the key thing to note here is in that last bar, you see that 2-hour sites are making up 90% of the new capacity that's come online to date. Anecdotally, we've seen that ENGIE, who hold the largest portfolio of batteries in ERCOT to date at just over 2 gigawatts, historically have had 31-hour sites. This last quarter, they've introduced 5 2-hour sites to the mix. What that shows is that these larger developers are now considering moving towards longer duration storage. In the near-term future, as soon as 2026, we're seeing even longer durations on the horizon. So not only do you see the trend for 2-hour sites over the past 5 years in terms of actual build-out, but looking at EIA projections, we're seeing that trend even further to 4-hour sites as well. And if we look at the investment case for this, we see that it does hold up. Brad, do you want to talk us through what we see here?
Yeah, so what we're looking at on this chart is just the projected pre-tax unlevered internal rate of return for energy storage projects of a given duration as projected by Modo Energy's ERCOT nodal forecast. So what we do is we take a look at how we expect market conditions to evolve and ultimately project power prices with our production cost model and simulate what storage revenues would be for a battery of a given duration at a given node on the ERCOT network. And then what we've done here with this chart is essentially we have our two different scenarios, our low forecast scenario in terms of if revenue opportunities are a little lower for storage resources versus our central scenario, which is our kind of our higher projection for revenues for storage resources. And breaking that up into an average for each of those scenarios across the different durations. So the red bar here represents the average for instance, all 1-hour batteries across all nodes in the ERCOT network, the average expected IRR that can be earned by those 1-hour resources, the blue bar representing the average across that central scenario. So the two key takeaways on this chart being that as we move up in durations here, what we're seeing is that projects of a 2-hour duration, 2-hour energy capacity relative to rated power and a 4-hour duration ultimately are projected to earn higher average returns relative to those lower duration sites. But the other caveat to that, of course, is that you also can see that the spread between the higher and the lower scenario and ultimately just the overall, the range of outcomes for the different durations tends to increase as we increase in the duration of a battery. So effectively, the upside for the 4-hour duration resource might be considered or projected to be higher, but also there's a range of outcomes. There's higher risk associated with those developments as well. So, the tighter range of outcomes for a 1-hour or even a 2-hour duration resource is potentially appealing. But as the revenue conditions change here, we're seeing more and more opportunity for 4-hour duration resources take hold. And now the next thing we're going to talk about here is a little bit of why that ultimately is. And really, it's a function of two things. We're talking about changing revenues and changing costs. So the first thing I want to talk about is the ratio of revenues between longer duration resources and shorter duration resources. If we actually switch this over to nominal revenues here, what we're showing is the average amount of revenue earned by batteries that are closer to 1-hour duration in ERCOT versus batteries that are closer to 2-hour durations in ERCOT. And this chart obviously shows that all in all, the revenues track relatively closely over time. The revenues track relatively closely over time, and as market conditions change, the magnitude of revenues ultimately changes with them for both durations of resources. But if we switch over to the ratio here, what we see is, back in 2022 and 2023, 1-hour duration resources were actually able to earn relatively comparable revenues to 2-hour duration resources. A lot of that is just driven by the fact that in ancillary service markets, 1-hour duration resources are still able to extract similar revenues to 2-hour duration resources. They're able to stack revenues across the day in the same way. They're able to qualify to provide almost as much AS capacity as those 2-hour duration resources. But as we move into 2024 and 2025, we're looking at battery revenues moving more towards an energy arbitrage dominant portfolio. So as we'll discuss more of that in a moment here, but what that's largely meant is that those longer duration resources are able to capture more of that additional revenue opportunity. So in 2024 and 2025, we've seen this ratio evolve to being more so around a 40 or 50% revenue premium for 2-hour duration resources relative to 1-hour duration. And in recent months, even in 2025, we've seen that creep up to numbers as high as 70 or 80% in terms of the premium that a 2-hour duration resource is able to capture. Now, part of the reason for that is we're going to walk through an example day of kind of how that might play out. So if we look at just the day ahead prices on this chart here, so this is just looking at a single day of operations. Right now, we just have the day ahead prices here. You can kind of see that this is ranging from a low of around $23, $24 in the morning hours to a peak of over $100 in the evening hours as the sun is setting here in ERCOT. So if you're a 1-hour duration battery, you'd sell you'd sell some energy in this 8 p.m. hour here to try to capture this day ahead spread, right? But then if we take a look at how real-time prices played out on the same day, if you're that same 1-hour battery and you sold energy in the day ahead market in this hour here, what we're seeing is real-time prices actually peaking later in the day. So essentially an additional hour or additional periods of time where a battery might want to capture some of those potential arbitrage spreads. Talking about multiple hours of prices being relatively low here in the real-time market to potentially buy energy, and then multiple hours in the evening where a battery could be trading between the day ahead and real-time market, or even if it was participating solely in the day ahead or in the real-time market, you might be talking about 2, 3, 4 consecutive hours where there's spreads worth capturing, which a 1-hour duration resource is going to be limited in the ability to, trade and have that flexibility to capture the spreads across multiple hours and really maximize that revenue opportunity. Whereas a longer duration resource has that flexibility. And kind of the last component in terms of why prices might evolve that way, just thinking about how much storage is now playing into what's happening in the real-time market, particularly during those evening price hours when batteries are actually dispatching. So this orange trend is just showing total fleet-wide net output for all batteries in ERCOT in terms of what they're doing with their actual power dispatch throughout the day. So obviously there's a lot of batteries charging up here when prices are low in the morning. And then as we get to those hours where day ahead prices peaked and ultimately storage operators are expecting real-time prices to peak, you see the peak in dispatch occurring, right around 8 p.m. So the storage operators that sold in the day ahead market or expecting the real-time prices to follow suit, that's when they're looking to capture the spreads. And then as, some of these batteries that, especially those shorter duration ones, start to run out of state of charge, we actually see prices in the real-time market starting to increase, right? So, again, this is just indicative of the idea that having that additional state of charge or that additional energy capacity that a longer duration resource might have is going to give more of an ability to capture excess revenues relative to the shorter duration resources. Now, that's kind of just the revenue side of what we're talking about for expectation of, how a longer duration resource might ultimately become a more appealing investment than a short duration resource. But cost is also equally as important. So what this chart is showing is just the total expected CapEx, or the average capital expenditure for just the energy component or energy capacity component of overall outlay. So when I say just the energy capacity component, I'm just talking about the cells and the actual containers for an energy storage system. And obviously dating back to 2020, talking about over $250,000 per installed megawatt of rated power for energy capital cost. And that's been falling over the last couple of years. You know, we had a little bit of a bump in 2022 and 2023, which was in part related to an increase, or largely driven by an increase in lithium prices. But overall, this has been trending downward for the last decade plus, and we expect that to continue. So, you know, as this continues, the appeal of adding that, or the cost burden of adding that additional energy capacity, that next hour of duration to your battery, really the burden continues to fall on the cost side. So you need less and less of a revenue premium to ultimately make to justify the addition of that additional second hour of capacity, or even that third and fourth hour of capacity, whether that's augmenting an existing site or just going ahead and building that 4-hour site from the start. So that's a little bit about just where we see storage deployment kind of coming and going, you know, in terms of recent months and recent years, and how we think it's going to evolve over the next couple of years. But let's talk a little bit about revenues in a bit more detail, rather than just talking about, you know, the ratio of different duration resources to another. 100%. Let's just talk about it, you know, as a whole.
100%. Cool. So what we see here is the cumulative revenue of the ERCOT fleet over the past year to date, so up until the end of September. And what we see here is that revenues across the fleet so far have averaged at about $24.5 per kilowatt. What you'll notice is that this line is quite steady throughout the year, especially compared to 2024. And this can be quite stark to see, where revenues in 2025 just are trending much lower than they were last year. The big reason for that really is you can see in 2024 these massive spikes in revenue, particularly in the start of the year in January, in May, and again towards the end of August, primarily because of constraints felt in the market, mostly due to weather, but also from some other reasons that we'll be capturing in a moment here. But really, I think this kind of jumpy curve in your cumulative revenue throughout the year is typical of ERCOT. You find that the majority of your revenues are earned on these incredibly constrained days, which I think if you look at 2023 shows just how massive these opportunities used to be, especially when some earlier entrants were participating in the market. 2025 just hadn't seen the same level of volatility, particularly in this past summer, that the previous 2 years have seen. And we'll get into a bit about why that is in particular. Here you see the revenues according to the Modo Energy BESS ERCOT index. This measures the amount of revenue that the entire ERCOT battery fleet is earning. You take the capacity allocations for ancillary services, the energy exported by each individual battery, the nodal price for that battery, and you combine that together to get the revenue for each individual battery. When you aggregate that across the entire fleet, you get a nominal figure for how much revenue each unit of capacity is earning in the market. It's how we benchmark revenues here at Modo Energy. What you see here, I think, as the main takeaway, first, that May and August, even though they saw a slight uptick in revenues, weren't as high as they were last year. And that's primarily due to the fall in ancillary service revenues. So you'll notice here in May of last year, where we had high revenues across ECRS, RRS, and the other ancillary services, you see a slight uptick in those ancillary service revenues here, but not as much. The reason for that is saturation. As batteries have entered into these products, there's a limited amount of capacity that ERCOT needs to procure for these services, which causes supply to outpace demand and prices for these services to fall. What you would expect then is that batteries then shift from earning revenues from ancillary services into energy. Now, the reason why, what we see here in absolute terms, energy revenues for the entire fleet have actually increased, but because the build out of the fleet has increased faster, the per kilowatt revenue earned from energy, as signified by the dark red and orange bars here, has actually just stagnated and has been a bit lower than it was last year. And I think this is representative of a broader trend as well in ERCOT. So we're now seeing that wholesale trading is making up over 50% of the revenue stack, which, as we saw previously, is mostly because of that ancillary service saturation. At Modo, we like to think of battery markets in terms of phases, where in the early days of a battery market growing, you have battery capacity participating in ancillary services, displacing thermal generation, and benefiting from high clearing prices. But as soon as battery capacity starts to saturate that market, You see a crash in ancillary services, as we've seen. And then as of September 2024 for last year, we see that the majority of revenues are now being earned in the energy arbitrage or wholesale trading market, which we'd like to think of as the longer term phase for ERCOT. Now, the issue then being in ERCOT that these price spreads haven't really manifested to be able to boost up the revenue case so far.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what you're saying about the idea of a lack in volatility so far in 2025. As ancillary services saturate, you're looking at more and more storage capacity now that's being forced to actually seek revenues by performing energy arbitrage, right? And the more storage capacity that's in the energy market, ultimately, again, it's a similar phenomenon of more supply means to actually get dispatched, you have to offer at more and more competitive prices, and that started to suppress some of that volatility. And you combine that with, some of the weather that we've seen in ERCOT in Texas in the last year or two being quite a bit more mild than it was in, say, 2023, when it was one of the hottest summers on record. A more average temperature normal summer that we saw in 2025 doesn't necessarily result in peak demand growth in the same way. And you have more supply during the highest priced hours of the day. It's kind of just a recipe for suppressing a lot of that volatility.
100%. I think, but considering this in the broader scheme of things, each of these charts shows what we consider Modo to be mature battery markets and the revenue seen in those markets, the distribution between energy arbitrage, ancillary services, and capacity revenues. I like to think of Texas and Australia as being quite similar markets because the majority of their revenues are earned from the merchant markets. This is opposed to a place like CAISO, where the resource adequacy program and the capacity payments, the fixed capacity payments you get from that scheme allows battery or props up or helps the revenues for batteries in those markets. Texas does not have a capacity market, so it's reliant on these energy spreads to be there for energy revenues to be high. What this means now is over the past few years, or rather actually before that, the reliance on energy arbitrage for the majority of revenues in the market means that because of the nature of nodal pricing, you're subject to the spread that's available to your battery. And because Texas has such a wide variety of congestion-driven price spikes across different points of the network, that then results in a divergence in battery revenue opportunity. So each of these bars on this chart shows a battery in ERCOT. And what you'd notice is that the highest earners are earning almost 20 times more than the lowest earners and twice as much as the median. This is especially true for the 2-hour sites, where, as we mentioned earlier, the majority of their revenues are being earned from energy arbitrage, as opposed to 1-hour sites, where you can see here the green portion in RRS, the blue portion in non-spin. These payments are paid out to the entire market at the same rate, which is why the locational element of revenue divergence is greater with 2-hour sites.
Absolutely. That 1-hour curve is definitely significantly flatter than the 2-hour curve, which really just speaks to the idea of all revenue opportunities not being created equal. And I guess kind of on that note, talking about inconsistent revenues and revenue opportunities not being created equal, that's not just locationally across the market, that's also temporally across month to month, year to year, right? So that sparked a bit of a desire to have more and more third-party optimization. It's made the optimization structure, just in general operation of a battery, more and more complex, right? So yeah, I guess that's kind of what you kind of showed in this chart here, right?
Yeah, 100%. So here we see that the amount of rated power capacity of batteries in the market, well, how much of that is being given out to third parties to operate. And at the moment, we see 25% of battery capacity in ERCOT today is held with third-party optimizers. If we look at the distribution of that, we see on the far left here that the bigger shops, like NG, as we mentioned previously, and NL Green Power, because of their relative size, they tend to be a one-stop shop for both the optimization and the financing of these projects. Whereas you look at further down towards the right, you see that these smaller, newer players in the market have chosen to finance these projects, but then contract these batteries out to third parties to operate them on their behalf. And this is really to try and make sure that they're securing their finance position by establishing, fixed contract arrangements with them, which we see on the next slide here. Here we see the batteries in ERCOT that are live today. We look at all the batteries in ERCOT, there's about 214 of them. 41 of these are now given out to third-party optimizers, of which 4 have announced publicly that they are under a tolling arrangement. Brad, do you want to talk a bit about how these tolling arrangements differ from general third-party optimization?
Yeah, so I think the first wave of it, right, was really thinking about, as as you mentioned, more just newer entrants, more market participants are coming into play in the ERCOT market, and as that's happening, where the optimization landscape is more complex than it was a few years ago, where it was just a little bit more set it and forget it when it came to a SACS ancillary service revenue day to day. Revenue opportunities are a little easier to come by. The level of optimization, the complexity wasn't quite as high as it is now, when it's trying to time exactly what market to participate in, and exactly when you should be charging and discharging, right? And so that ultimately, I think, has meant that there's been more and more of a push towards those third-party optimizers, right? But when it comes to the tolling agreement side, I think a lot of that is driven by the relative, height or not, or I guess, rising and falling of the overall revenue opportunity and therefore revenue capture it consistently month to month, right? So what we were just looking at the last 12 to 18 months, revenue opportunities have fallen quite a bit for storage resources in Texas. And I think what that's meant is you've had a longer period of time where developers and owners of storage resources are maybe having a bit harder time, especially making those payments to the debt service payments on their projects, right? And so what that's meant is there's more of an appetite for resources coming into the market to have offtake secured. And what we mean by offtake is actually having a consistent month-to-month revenue stream or quarter-to-quarter revenue stream that is provided by a third party or an offtaker that is saying, hey, we'll take on control of your battery, take on the downside and the upside of operating in the market month to month. We're going to pay you a flat fee for control of that battery, which, if the offtaker, if it works for them on a price component where it's a high enough rate that they're able to earn enough on a consistent basis to make those debt service payments, and then potentially have enough of that upside to still capture the IRR that they're looking to capture. That kind of works for them when they're able to divest themselves of that risk. Whereas the offtaker is able to say, we don't necessarily have all that upfront capital invested, so we want to take a swing at capturing that upside, whether that's only happening once every couple of years or not. We want to be there when it does happen because we don't have as much invested and we can ride out some of those low periods. And so, as you mentioned, there's now 4 operational batteries and a couple more coming in San Antonio that are operated under tolls as of today, including the newly completed Boca Nova BESS just outside of Houston, operated or owned again by another newer entrant in the market in Night Peak Energy that is saying, all right, that's fine. We'll take that flatter tolling agreement fee from Shell, who's then saying, all right, we want to pursue that upside, right?
100%. With the rise of contracted arrangements like these, like tolling arrangements, it then begs the question, how do you enter into these agreements with third parties? How do you benchmark optimizers against each other? And one way that we could do that is by looking at what we call top-bottom price spreads. So this is a measure where if you look at the top-bottom 1-hour price spread, for example, you're looking at the difference between the top and bottom, peak and trough of a price curve on a given day. For a battery, that measures the arbitrage potential. So how much revenue you can earn from arbitraging the peak and trough price against each other. TB2s then measure that same, but for 2-hour batteries, top 2 and bottom 2-hour prices. Looking at this chart, what we're going to walk through is how you can actually use these price spreads to measure how optimizers are performing in the market. So if you see here, each of these bars represents a certain optimizer in ERCOT. If we take an example on the left here of Jupiter Power that has 9 assets across its portfolio, it's earning $3.92 per kilowatt month over the course of 2025. Now we're going to add in here your TBX potential. So this is for each of the individual batteries in that portfolio. You add up the TB spread, the average TB spread over the same period from January to July. What this gives you is a heuristic for if these batteries are being optimized perfectly, how much revenue that they could get from energy arbitrage. It's just one way of measuring maximum potential. And you take the ratio of these two. You then say, okay, you look at the actual revenues earned against how much the potential revenue was, and that gives you a figure, a capture rate that you can use to benchmark optimizers against each other. It's not perfect. There are some limitations. For example, 1-hour sites will have an easier time achieving higher capture rates because of the fact that it's a single moving target to hit as opposed to 2 with 2-hour duration sites. But I think it's a start to try and start a conversation on how you can compare optimizers against each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking a little bit more about, I guess, kind of evaluating optimizer performance, again, we've been talking a little bit about how the optimization and operation landscape is becoming a little bit more complex in ERCOT, and a lot of that driven by, needing to participate more so in energy arbitrage and that being harder to capture. But one of the other things that's, kind of on the horizon for potentially impacting operational complexity in ERCOT is real-time co-optimization. So Real-time co-optimization is going live in just under 2 months here in December. And really what that means, what the program, the market design change is designed to do, is all it is bringing ancillary service procurement from exclusively happening in the day-ahead market to happening in both the day-ahead market and the real-time market. And so really what that does is it opens up additional flexibility and efficiency gains for the system operator. The way that happens is, now that resources aren't exclusively tied to their ancillary service awards in the day-ahead market, they're now tied to, or they're now able to move in and out of those positions as real-time approaches, depending on how system conditions change. And on the system operator side, ERCOT's economic dispatch is now able to see the entire optimization landscape. It's not seeing capacity tied up in ancillary services that might enable the system operator to achieve an actual lower all-in cost between energy, ancillary services, congestion. Because it then can say, let's us reassign some of this capacity to another resource to provide ancillary services, and we'll use that lower cost resource to actually provide energy, and that can reduce total system costs. But in all of that happening, there's some additional complexities opened up in terms of how you kind of trade between different markets and how you participate and allocate your batteries, particularly allocate your capacity, particularly as a battery, between energy and ancillary services as real-time approaches. So if we get into a couple of those changes that are actually coming, the first one I want to talk about is duration requirements. So when I say duration requirements, there's now kind of two ways to really think about that. It's in terms of qualifying to provide ancillary services, and it's in terms of how much actual energy you have stored to provide ancillary services in real time, moment to moment. So starting on that qualification side of things, this is the duration requirement that actually exists today. These current blue bubbles represent the duration requirement to qualify for energy capacity or to qualify for ancillary service deployment in today's market. So let's just take the example of a 1 hour duration resource today. For example, with ECRS, right now the duration requirement is 2 hours. So that 1 hour duration battery can only qualify to provide up to half of its rated power in ECRS. So a 100 megawatt 1 hour battery can only qualify to provide up to 50 megawatts. A 100 megawatt 2 hour battery can still qualify to provide its full rated power for ECRS. Now, for RRS and regulation, the current duration requirements for qualification are only 1 hour. So almost all resources in ERCOT are able to qualify to provide 100% of their rated capacity in either of those services. And for non-spin, it's 4 hours, which means that, again, a 1 hour duration resource can qualify to provide up to a quarter of its rated power. Now, what's changing under RTC is that these duration requirements for ECRS, RRS, and both regulation services are being reduced. Now, that primarily impacts the ECRS service. So for 1 hour duration resources in particular are going to be impacted. Now they'll go from being able to provide or being able to qualify to provide only around half of their rated power to being able to qualify to provide their full rated power. So that same 100 megawatt 1 hour duration resource can now qualify to provide its full 100 megawatts in ECRS. That's the major change when it comes to qualification. That's actually has the potential to unlock as much as 2.5 gigawatts of additional battery capacity qualified to provide ECRS just from 1 hour duration resources that are going to be able to requalify at a higher amount. Now, the counteracting thing that's also being introduced as part of RTC is the implementation of state of charge duration requirements interval to interval in real time. So as ERCOT is procuring ancillary services in the real-time market, it will also be considering the amount of energy that a battery actually has stored when when the economic dispatch is deciding whether to award it capacity or not. So, what that essentially means is for ECRS, again, for instance, that has that 1 hour duration requirement, for every 1 megawatt of ECRS award that a battery could potentially receive, it has to actively have 1 megawatt hour of energy stored to be able to provide that. Again, for RRS and regulation, that duration requirement is half an hour. So for every 1 megawatt, that's half a megawatt hour of energy that needs to be stored. And for non-spin, again, that 4 hour duration requirement really rears its head for sure. Again, primarily impacting those shorter duration resources in particular. A 1 hour, for every 1 megawatt of award, you need to have 4 megawatt hours of energy stored in your battery to receive that award. Now, in terms of kind of how that impacts day-to-day operations, let's just kind of walk through an example here in terms of an example 150 megawatt, 150 megawatt hour battery. So 1 hour in duration. It's kind of we're assuming it's coming into the day with full state of charge at 150 megawatt hours stored. And we're also assuming it's fully qualified to the maximum amount under the duration requirements that we just spoke about for the qualification side of things. So it's pursuing a pretty aggressive strategy in ancillary services throughout the day. We see it stacking AS awards across RRS, non-spin, ECRS, depending on how prices evolve throughout the day. Now, if we flip over to RTC, we see that there are some limitations that start to come into play because of those state of charge requirements. For instance, if we assume that non-spin is the most appealing service when it comes to the clearing price from, say, that 6 a.m. hour to around 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, to the point where the battery would prefer to receive those non-spin awards because it's a much greater value than the other ancillary services, then essentially it's actually only going to be limited to receiving just that 37.5 megawatts of non-spin award, because again, for every 1 megawatt of non-spin awarded, you have to have 4 megawatt hours of energy stored in the battery. Now, if we think back to how it works today, the battery can actually secure that same 37.5 megawatt award across the same period of time because there's not the same state of charge consideration. Now, this is technically would be infeasible in terms of if those deployments actually happen in real time today, but it's unlikely that this would impact storage operations, and a battery operator could stack these revenues in today's market. But under RTC, it will no longer be able to do this because the economic dispatch it's just going to be infeasible based on the amount of state of charge that the battery has. A couple other places where this does come into play is, as we look to the evening here, as the battery starts to discharge, it's with this decline in the state of charge actually stored in the battery here. The red indicates the fact that its actual rated power, it's increasing. Its real-time throughput is being dispatched to provide energy in the market. So that's decreasing its state of charge. And interval by interval, we see the amount of ancillary services that battery is awarded as actually declining as its state of charge is declining as well. So, again, just increased complexity coming into play as RTC goes live here. There's lots of different scenarios in which this can play out. There's actually a flip side too, where, the battery actually being able to move in and out of these positions as real time approaches. Even if we think back to what we talked about with that day-to-day price curve of just the energy prices, if real time prices are significantly higher, in the later evening hours, way after the day ahead prices, we might see some uplift in ancillary service clearing prices, which would mean, more potential for AS revenues in those instances. It would also mean, that a battery is able to, move in and out of AS positions that it may have been locked into under the current market construct. And if it still has that state of charge, pursue those real-time price spikes. So, lots of flexibility that is added here, but also, again, some potential limitations and additional, monitoring that you have to do for your own battery when it comes to state of charge. So having said all that and really gotten down into the weeds with real-time co-optimization, let's zoom back out a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the longer-term policy implications of something like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and how that's potentially going to impact some of the decision-making processes that developers and investors are going to be going through when it comes to whether it's worth it to pursue those tax credits over the next few years here.
100%. Cool. So I think there's two main takeaways to be taking from the outcome of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on battery energy storage developers. The very first one is that tax credit timelines for batteries don't change, which is good news for battery developers. If we look here, before OBBA, the way the tax credits work is that they'll be allowed to you based off of when you are issuing your construction for your site. And then if you were to start construction on your site after a certain target date, so 2034, you would be eligible to receive a lower percentage of the tax credits. If you were to start construction prior to 2034, you'd be eligible for the full amount. We see that under OBBA, the tax credit timelines for battery energy storage specifically remains unchanged. It does affect wind and solar, however, which lose 8 years of tax credit runway. Brian, anything you want to add on this slide here?
Yeah, I think just for storage, the key thing here is that the timeline actually stays unchanged. But as we'll talk about in a minute here, this isn't the only. It's not quite as simple as this, right? There's other considerations that still are going to be in play when it comes to eligibility for tax credits, right? And I guess that kind of gets into the idea of what's potentially going to be happening when more of the guidance comes down regarding foreign entity of concerns and the idea of how that can potentially impact your supplier decisions. So one of the other requirements, so even though the tax credits are still available to storage resources all the way to 2034, there's increasingly stringent requirements on how you qualify for those tax credits. And the number one potential limiter for storage resources is going to be on where they're actually getting their project costs from in terms of, where they're buying their actual storage containers and themselves for within those containers in particular. So as of today, what's going to be happening as we get to 2026 is the minimum amount of your total project costs that can come from prohibited foreign entities in terms of your supplier costs is just 55%. And that's rising to 75% as we get to 2030. And what we mean by when we say prohibited foreign entities or foreign entities of concern is the designated list from the US federal government, which consists of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So for storage developers and investors, that's primarily going to be dealing with Chinese suppliers. Basically this just means that as time goes on, you're going to have to move from having a larger proportion of your total cost to a smaller proportion of your total cost coming from those foreign entity of concern based suppliers. Now, specific guidance on exactly what's entailing a PFE supplier hasn't necessarily come down yet. So, there may be ways around this, but the key being that, over time to qualify for tax credits, you're going to have to move away from potentially some of the legacy suppliers that have been used for developing storage resources. So what we've done here is try to develop a framework for, how you can kind of approach that decision-making process of whether it's worth pursuing an alternative supplier. And so what this graph is showing is on the y-axis, this is just your assumed cost baseline if you're looking at procuring your total system cost, total CapEx, with the threshold not being met to qualify for tax credits, essentially. So a certain percentage of your project costs are coming from those prohibited foreign entities. And so we're assuming this is the baseline, cheapest potential cost outlay. This is your kind of what you'd assume your current state of play is for costs. Now, if we introduce this secondary line here, this is kind of the trade-off of on the x-axis, what is the cost premium impact of switching suppliers? So if you say, all right, I still want to qualify for these tax credits, I'm going to switch suppliers so that I actually am, within those fiat guidelines. I'm under that percentage threshold to say that, I still qualify for the tax credits, but it's going to come with an additional cost burden. This x-axis represents the additional cost burden depending on, if you switch suppliers. So, what we're saying here is, at the baseline here, we're saying there's no additional cost to switching suppliers. This orange line here being a 50 percentage point increase in cost impact of switching suppliers. Now, because you've switched suppliers, let's assume you still qualify for the tax credit. So you're getting that 30% decrease in your total cost basis because of the fact that you still qualify for the tax credit. Whereas in the case of if you just went with your existing supplier, the blue line, you don't qualify for the tax credit. So that shifts your now switched supplier costs downward by applying that tax credit. You're shifting it down by 30%. And what we've essentially determined here is that a 43 percentage point increase in cost premium from switching suppliers is worth it if you can still secure that 30% investment tax credit. So if your additional cost burden of switching suppliers in whatever configuration it ends up being to still qualify for the tax credit is less than 43 percentage points, when you apply that 30% tax credit decrease, your net cost basis is actually still lower. Now, if your cost premium exceeds 43%, that's where it starts to get tricky and where you might say, it's actually not worth it to pursue the investment tax credit. We're better off just keeping the cheaper supplier in this case. Mm-hmm. So that's where that kind of trade-off lies. But interestingly here, if we change that to some projects are actually going to be able to qualify for that 50% investment tax credit if they meet some additional qualification thresholds. So what that'll mean actually is that you can actually stomach an up to a 100% increase in CapEx premium from switching suppliers, where it's still potentially worth it to pursue the investment tax credit. So obviously everybody's scenario is going to be different. Costs are constantly going to be shifting. And so it's all going to depend on what suppliers you have available to you and ultimately what the guidance for FEOC ends up saying. But I think that's really just representative of what the trade-off entails in terms of, can I secure the ITC? What's my cost premium? Mm-hmm. And ultimately, depending on which side of the line you fall on, whether it'll be worth it or not. And I think that's pretty much all we have for the actual deck here. So I think let's throw it over to some Q&A. So why are peak revenue potentials occurring during off-peak hours? So peak prices in ERCOT have kind of shifted over the last couple of years. If we were to look back to the average price profile in ERCOT and say like 2022, you'd actually see peak prices, like the highest points in price and therefore highest revenue opportunities for storage resources happening kind of in those middle of the afternoon hours when actual raw demand is peaking in ERCOT. Now we've seen that shift away to the evening hours, more like 7, 8, 9 p.m., primarily because it's now much more tied to when the sun is up, really. So when there's a large amount of solar generation in ERCOT. And really the reason for that is, solar generation, much like storage here in the last couple of years, but really accelerated a couple of years ahead of it, has been on this massive hockey stick upswing in ERCOT. If we think back to 2019, 2020, there's only, 3, 4, 5 gigawatts of solar capacity installed in ERCOT. And now here we are in 2025, and there's over 30 gigawatts of solar generation installed capacity in ERCOT. So really what that's meant is that now in 2025, you're consistently seeing more than 20 gigawatts of solar generation at the bottom of the energy offer price stack during those peak demand hours. So even though demand is at its highest, you have all of this additional low cost wholesale power coming into play that's, suppressing prices during what would have traditionally been those peak hours to the point where now we're talking about the peak hours being typically when what we call net demand peaks, which is net demand or net load is calculated as actual demand minus wind minus solar generation. And so typically that tends to peak when the sun is going down in ERCOT roughly around 7, 8 p.m. in the summer. And it's still, especially in the summertime, relatively hot outside, so you have a fair amount of residual demand still. And what that's meant is that you have all this low cost generation falling out of the stack. And ultimately, you're starting to rely more on more expensive sources of generation, like whether it's energy storage that's kind of helping to come in and fill the gap, or your peaking natural gas plants as well. So that's largely why it's shifted to those later hours of the day in the last few years.
And I think to add on that as well, with flexibility providers like thermal plants, for example, being on outage season in large portions of the year, it relies more heavily on battery capacity to be able to get ERCOT through those net load ramping hours. Now, storage is a limited duration resource. And as we saw in those charts towards the start of the presentation, with 1 or 2 hour resources being the de facto standard for storage in ERCOT today, we see that these storage resources often, if solar forecasts sometimes miss during those net load hours and your storage runs out, you have high amount of your thermal fleet that's on outages, that creates more opportunities for these these high price hours to happen after the traditional peak once your storage resources have depleted themselves. And that's kind of what we were discussing towards the start of the presentation there.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Nice. Okay. So do you expect price volatility over the next 3 to 5 years to increase sufficiently to generate around 12% internal rate of returns for merchant, i.e. non-contracted assets? So I think this kind of speaks to what we were talking about with our, ERCOT nodal forecast that our data science team here at Modo Energy has developed. So what we do with that is we model our expectations for, the input side of the production cost model, talking about how we expect demand growth to evolve here in the next few years, what thermal generation we do expect to retire in terms of primarily coal-fired generation, as well as, how we see the transmission build out evolving and things like that too. Then we look at the supply side and, ultimately what revenue environment kind of entails in terms of what we think is going to get built in the next few years, along with what's in the interconnection queue today. We take all those inputs, we run them through the built-in house production cost model, clear the market, determine power prices. And then for a storage resource, we then run those power prices at a given node through a dispatch model and then say, okay, this is what our estimation of revenues is based on, how a storage resource would typically try to operate in this type of environment. Now, our expectation over the next 3 to 5 years, and really over the entire investment life cycle of a storage resource that might be starting operation tomorrow, is that, we're expecting that there will be some additional volatility that's coming again in the future. And that's because, I think our expectation is that the last year or two is not necessarily indicative of all of the remainder of history in terms of the investment life cycle for a new storage resource. So it's hard to say for sure whether it's coming next year, maybe. We haven't necessarily seen peak demand growth happen quite as quickly as some of what ERCOT's long-term load forecast would maybe indicate is going to happen here in the next couple of years. But we know that there is a lot of demand that has a lot of interest in connecting to the grid in ERCOT. A lot of these data centers are starting to materialize. I think just anecdotally talking about the Abilene Clean Campus, we've already seen 200 megawatts of that come online. We're expecting to see another gigawatt or so in the next year or thereabouts. And, we won't see 200 gigawatt peak demand by 2030, but even if, a quarter of what's stated comes online, we're still talking about peak demand growing to well over 100 gigawatts by 2030. And that increase from where it is today of around 85 gigawatts is going to require quite a bit of supply build out to kind of keep pace. And if the revenue environment stays like it is today, that's also going to incentivize in the meantime, before that demand growth shows up, some of those thermal generators starting to retire, coal generation, a lot of those resources in ERCOT are already scheduled to retire at some point in the next few years. So you combine those two factors, and I think the expectation would be that if you build in some expectation of volatility when it comes to weather events as well, you get another really hot summer like 2023, or you get an unseasonably warm spring season, or a couple of winter events where you're getting weather that's below freezing in Texas, and you have the potential for some of this volatility to start to manifest at some point in the next few years. Yeah, it's a question of when, absolutely. It might not be for a few more years, depending on how fast this demand growth comes or when the weather events happen. But our expectation is that over the course of especially that 10 to 15 year investment life cycle for storage resource, we're expecting to see revenue opportunities sufficient to generate that 12% IRR. And ultimately, our forecast does say that that's likely to really be happening around the end of this decade when some of that demand growth really has started to materialize and some of that thermal generation retirement, some of those thermal generation retirements have happened. So long-winded answer saying yes, but I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is obviously one that's definitely top of mind for a lot of people as real-time co-optimization goes live here in a couple of months. So the question just being, how do you expect real-time co-optimization plus batteries to impact BESS revenues? And this is a little bit of what we were trying to get at with some of those slides earlier. But I think when we zoom back out from the super specific example we were talking about and think about that first slide, the expectation is that it should be a massive efficiency booster for ERCOT's economic dispatch and how it clears the market. And so likely what that should mean is that all-in energy prices, around-the-clock prices, as well as therefore peak power prices and spreads available to batteries, is likely to decline relative to the current market construct. So that's likely a long-term net negative for energy storage revenues. Now, I think what we could say is if we compare that to the current market construct of like how 2025 is played out, I don't know that we'd see necessarily a huge impact to storage revenues there, because the biggest impact is going to be those periods of volatility, right? Because ERCOT will have, we're talking about hockey sticks a lot, but talking about the offer curve for generation resources in an energy market as you get towards those more supply scarcity moments in the operating day or within a year. You're talking about getting into the steeper part of the supply curve where generation resources are offering at exponentially more expensive prices than the resource you might have needed if demand was a gigawatt less or whatever at that given point in time. And because we're talking about fine margins here in terms of if you're able to just use that less expensive generator by maneuvering the allocation of ancillary service capacity and energy dispatch around, you're able to minimize some of that volatility that might occur in terms of how the market clears if speaking from the perspective of the system operator, ERCOT here. So potentially minimizing some of those extreme volatility events, that's likely obviously going to be a net negative on storage revenues. What we were talking about there with that super specific example in the slide deck is potentially how in the short term, there is some potential for some upside, particularly in ancillary services with some of that increased flexibility. And ultimately, real-time co-optimization is a huge market design change. I think there's going to be going to be an adjustment period of at least a couple of months there in terms of people figuring out like, okay, well, how do I actually position my battery within the market to be the most successful? So I think while there's some of that uncertainty and, ultimately also, ancillary service products are then tied to the volatility of the real-time market, there's a potential for some uplift there. So I think overall long-term RTC is probably a net negative for storage revenues, but with some potential for, additional flexibility and additional uplift for the operators that are able to kind of catch on in terms of what the optimal configuration of their battery is.
There's opportunity on the margins, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. We've gone through a few questions there, and I think we're going to end up calling it there. But we have, I think, a few questions in the chat. So, we'll try to get back to everybody who has asked something. Definitely just send us an email. And ultimately, thank you so much for coming today. We're going to make these slides publicly available here on the Modo Energy Terminal. And once again, thanks for watching. Really appreciate you tuning in.
Bye for now. Thank you.